Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Perestroika puzzle. Why did you have Perestroika at all? So Gorbachev followed a process of Perestroika, and there were a couple of reasons why. We could talk about a structural argument and a strategic argument, which we'll talk about today, and then we'll look at how Perestroika affected Central Asia in particular. And in the next set of lectures, we're actually going to go in more detail to the processes of Perestroika within Central Asia. So why did you have Perestroika at all? Well, the conventional explanation is that there was too much demand for below and the Communist Party was forced to deal with it. And there's lots of truth to this. So why did you have all these pressures from below? Well, for one thing, you had a glass ceiling. People wanted more. So there was only so much mobility that the Soviet system could provide given the nature of the system. Remember, if you were at sort of the elite level within the Communist Party, within the nomenclatura, this state bureaucracy, you had access to things that other people didn't have. Well, these are what we call private goods, and if you provide too many, there's only a limited number of private goods you can feasibly provide, and if you have more and more people who want to get into these positions to access to private goods, then the whole system begins to collapse because then there are fewer and fewer goods for each person. So the glass ceiling was caused by the population growth on one hand, but also the increased education relative to the possibilities for upward mobility. So as people were completing the universities, they wanted to move into a position that they didn't want to deliver trash, they didn't want to sweep streets, they wanted to move into positions of responsibility and positions that would get them more material benefits. And there simply weren't, there wasn't the availability of these positions. You also had the weakening of the Soviet economy because of major structural deficiencies, all the things that we talked about before. The Soviet economy just couldn't function because it was a poorly planned, centrally planned economy. In addition, you had an increased understanding of differences with abroad. And this could include Central Europe, but especially Western Europe and other parts of the world. People would often turn their satellite dishes to the west at night and then hide them in the daytime. And so prosperity, of course, is relative depending on your reference point. So we Soviets might be very prosperous compared to Chad or Zambia, which we see on the news frequently, but we don't live like they do in France. People began to see this for themselves in the 1980s because you had less of a stick of the Soviet state, and so people were more willing to take risks and look for, and you also had more technology, which allowed for people to grab those radio and television signals from abroad. And you also had increased spending on armaments and worsening conditions for consumers. So all these things really came together to cause a pent-up sort of anger. And all this also points to a structural explanation, which are that you had certain conditions which necessitated perestroika, perestroika being transformation, economic transformation. So a quick review of the Brezhnev period. When you think about the neo-patrimonial system that existed during this period, the general well-being of the population under Brezhnev was really exchanged for loyalty or at least acquiescence on the part of elites. Again, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You administer the system in your republic the way you want to, as long as you swear your allegiance to me. So there was lots of corruption. Everyone was involved in the corrupt system, but those on top were getting the most out of it. There were huge state subsidies from the center to the periphery. So from Moscow going out to each of the republics, and also from the elites to the masses. We're talking about bread and butter things, but we're not talking about the major consumer goods that those at the top were getting. And there were high costs to this, which meant that it was difficult to continue producing these sorts of things, these subsidies, etc. You had falling rates of growth, of economic growth, from about 7.8% in the mid-1960s, when you're still industrializing, to about 3.5% by the early 1980s. And with this comes a net fall in agricultural output. Looking at the Soviet workplace, you have a workplace that has practically no discipline. There's excessive alcohol consumption, which doubled between 1960 and 1980. To give you an example of the no discipline, which I'm talking about, there was a survey in 1982 that found that there was about 30% absenteeism from the workplace. In a Moscow survey from around the same time, they estimated that about 10% of workers were actually at their place of work at closing time, which isn't a surprise when you have to stand in line for 3 hours to get bread and milk, when you have to go to get the kids, you have to cook dinner, and all these other things. So it showed that the system was really rotting, and local party leaders had been given autonomy in return for obedience to Brezhnev, which led to the embezzlement, falsified production quotas, bribes going every direction. But again, all this was really, especially at the prosperous part, was at the top. So Brezhnev's period was really a period of stagnation and also an increasing technology gap with the West. You had a missile gap, and then you had the development of Star Wars by Reagan, or at least talk of developing the Star Wars network, and it had already begun sort of in the nascent phases. You had the growth of corruption, you had the black market. So the legitimacy of the system and the elites in charge were really threatened by this point. Think about what the social contract is in any state. And if you've taken 260, you know what this is, and probably other poly classes. So the social contract is the understanding that we trade certain freedoms of ours in exchange for greater security by the state. Now, in the Soviet Union, this had always been compulsory because they had a strong stick. They had a strong repressive apparatus. But now you no longer, by the 1970s, and especially by the 1980s, you no longer have terror to keep people in line. And the promises and the demands, the promises by the state are really empty, given that you've got much higher demands which exceed delivery. So official promises are actually generating these higher levels of demands. When you say every day in the state press that everything is rosy, things are getting better and better, then people are going to expect things to get better. When they don't see that, that's going to jeopardize the legitimacy of the system. So at this point, there was an acknowledgement by the early 1980s that reforms were necessary. There's a general consensus about this. But people didn't, the elites at the top didn't know how to go about doing this. And Andropov was the first of two interim leaders, and I say interim because he was old and half dead. It was a sort of a compromise. It was a result of indecision and a lack of consensus at the top about how to go about reforming the system. And so they took this cautious approach. And Andropov, as you remember, leads an attack on corruption. He tries to limit alcohol consumption, and then he dies. Now, what's important to understand is that Gorbachev, who had been a go-between for Andropov and the Politburo at the time, rose to power only after Chernenko briefly took control and tried to reverse all of Andropov's policies, and then died again because he was old and sick and had little impact. So Gorbachev really comes to power as a result, in 1985, as a result of this rising consensus that things really do have to change now. We've wasted time. Now, was Gorbachev a populist? He wasn't a populist at all. In fact, he came off as overzealous to many within the population. In 1986, maybe it was 1985, when he first came to power, he launched a major anti-alcohol campaign. And when I was in when I was in Russia in 1994, people told me that this is what they remembered most about Gorbachev's rule. People were very angry about Gorbachev because of this. So this is evidence in itself that Perestroika wasn't just about popular pressures for change. Gorbachev had to fight off Brezhnev's disciples, and he struggled to get young reformist blood into power, which leads to the second argument, the strategic one that you see here. Promises of liberal change for Gorbachev were seen as an effective strategy to use to defeat opponents and consolidate power. So there were short-term benefits, defeat the opponents, which Gorbachev felt outweighed the long-term potential costs, the threat of popular mobilization against even proponents, the threat of popular mobilization that might actually throw Gorbachev out of power and end the Soviet Union as it did. This wasn't even a thought in Gorbachev's head that the Soviet Union could end. It's a really irrational choice perspective. Gorbachev grabbed at these short-term gains at the cost of long-term risks. He wanted to undermine his opponents in the near term by using liberalization, and he took this risky policy. Remember, he could have used terror and totalitarianism, arguably. He could have gone back to that sort of system, but it would have involved different sorts of costs, and he found it more strategically advantageous to pursue liberalism. He planned broad economic reforms eventually after a few years. He didn't plan on doing these immediately. He focused on decentralization of the economy, lowering the size of the administration, providing better access to information through glasnost and increased economic incentives. He began to get rid of production quotas, so people could produce as much as they could produce, and introduce sort of market rates. Operation of private services like taxis, allowing workers to elect shop foremen to give them a sense of partnership. Sorry, those were the short-term risks. And Gorbachev did encounter resistance. We'll stay here. This threatened many elites who were dependent on the status quo that Brezhnev had created. There were lots of entrenched interests. They were really reactionaries who fought back, arguing that you didn't need broad economic reform, just more discipline. And many of these people wanted to go back to a time that Stalin had created. They attacked glasnost as the cause of ethnic strife and anarchy. They made formidable enemies since they were from the party. They could actually use the state press to attack Gorbachev. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but what they did is they forced Gorbachev to move more aggressively. It went from what they call uskarение, or acceleration of the program, to full-blown perestroika and glasnost. He could have backed down, but these were the objectives that Gorbachev had. First, he wanted to modernize the state, the technological infrastructure of the state. Remember, this is the period when Reagan's talking about Star Wars. You can also recall the role of satellite TV, which I just talked about. People saw Western standards, and people demanded those Western standards. And so Gorbachev wanted to modernize. In order to do this, he wanted to decentralize the management structures, reorganize the modes of production. So not everything was decided here in Moscow in this big building. Allow people to decide more on them by themselves at the factory level. And the third element here was to crack down on waste and inefficiency, which defined the system. And in order to do this, you needed an element of the fourth element here, democratization, or glasnost. So perestroika refers to economic restructuring. Glasnost, from the Russian word golos, refers to this liberal democratization, allowing more openness. So glasnost is more openness, encouraging people to speak out. And the whole point of this was to really deal with the number 3, increased efficiency. As people speak out, there's going to be more accountability among lower level leaders. People are going to speak out against corruption. They're going to speak out against inefficiency. When the factory owners, or factory manager, I should say, the state's the owner, when the factory manager is stealing, people are going to speak out against it, and and it's going to come to an end, ideally. It's important also to remember that democratization becomes increasingly important to gaining popular support, because Gorbachev was up against a giant. There were lots of people with vested interests that Gorbachev had to maneuver around. Again, it's important to remember that the ultimate aim of perestroika and glasnost was to rebuild and not destroy the Soviet Union. Gorbachev wanted to put the Soviet Union back on a fast track as a world superpower. He wanted to protect political positions of the reformers so they could get a bigger piece of the political pie. He also critically wanted to weaken political enemies by splitting them over issues and undermining them in the public sphere. All these were what Gorbachev wanted to do with perestroika. A couple more comments before I go on to Central Asia. Gorbachev's tactic of delegating more authority to legislators, national and subnational, so republic-level legislatures, actually was also used to undermine his political enemies. He guaranteed that local party heads, assuming they could be popularly supported, would be in charge of these local legislatures. And that helped him gain powerful allies on his side. Moreover, he also said that control should be transferred from the party, who were Communist Party leaders, were really headed the sort of opposition to Gorbachev's reforms, and the power should be transferred to the state. So this would help undercut those who were against him. In effect, those conservative party leaders who didn't switch sides were pushed out of power as a result of the lack of support they received from the top and from the masses as well. Now, Gorbachev ultimately lost power because he lost control over the entire process, as you saw in your readings. So there was this momentum where the engine was ultimately being passed by the restaurant car where all the people were sitting. And as in other places, reforms created a greater desire by the public for more reforms, and put Gorbachev between a rock and a hard place. He still needed elite support. He didn't want to go much further, but he'd empowered the state over the party, and state officials didn't want to see their positions undermined. And so you had the growth of popular demands. And this became ultimately really impossible for Gorbachev to balance. And eventually it helped push Gorbachev out, and the Soviet Union crumbled. Gorbachev simply couldn't balance the demands for more power by the people and for more control by those at the top. And he was sort of hedging his bets and unable to get support from either here or there as a result. The people who were still in power didn't support him because they felt like they were losing power. The people at the bottom, the masses, didn't support him anymore because they felt like he wasn't catering to the masses. And so that helped bring about the end to the Soviet Union. I'll take out Perestroika in Central Asia in a new slide.